I always thought that chef's knives sort of resembled wizard wands in a weird way. The cook doesn't choose the knife chooses the cook. The multiverse of kitchen knives and knife sharpening is vast. Things can get very technical and very nerdy very fast. That's a poem. To those of you just starting off, buying your first knife, learning how to sharpen, this whole thing can be very intimidating, so I wanted to create this video to sort of combat that intimidation factor. So my goal with this video is to provide you with a comprehensive entry-level introduction to the kitchen knife universe. A sharp knife in the kitchen is going to make your life a lot easier. It's the difference between slicing through food versus crushing it, or mincing a shallot oh so finely, or slicing your finger off, or at least cutting it, which sucks. You don't want that, trust me. Before we begin, I will preface this video by saying that I by no means am a metallurgist, or a professional knife sharpener. However, over the past few years, I've spent a solid chunk of time researching knives and have become decent at sharpening my knife. I can get it pretty sharp. And if you are new to the knife game, I think that you're gonna find some of the stuff that I know to be pretty useful. Okay, so we have a ton to cover, so let's talk a little bit about the knife itself, the components, what makes up a knife. We use it every time we're in the kitchen, so let's get to know it a little bit. Okay, so here we have, you can see the back and the front of the knife, the point and the butt. We have the tip, the spine, the blade, the edge, the bolster, the heel, the handle, the tang, the rivets, and again, the butt. These are the rivets, these little circle things. Knowing a little terminology is gonna do nothing but help in our journey to learn about knives, so there you go. A quick point about the bolster of the knife here. A lot of Western knives have a chunky sort of bolster thing that protrudes out and sort of protects your fingers. I don't like them. They're a little clunky. They get in the way when sharpening. I choose to purchase knives without them. Just wanted to mention that, put it out there. It might not bother you, you might like the way it looks, so you do you, but I choose to purchase knives without that little chunky bit. All right, moving along. Okay, so we talked about what makes up a knife. Now, what are they actually made of? Knives can be made out of lots of things. People used to make them out of stone. I guess nowadays people make them with meteorite sometimes. For the sake of the video, let's focus in on the big boys. Those big boys are carbon steel and stainless steel. Neither carbon or stainless is better or worse than the other. They're just different, and it really depends sort of what you're looking for and what's right for you. But we will talk about product recommendations later in the video. Again, I am no metallurgist, so to summarize in my unlearned way, generally speaking, stainless steel is softer than carbon, which means that it's easier to sharpen, but might not stay sharp as long as carbon. On the other hand, carbon is just steel with a higher carbon content. What this means to you is that it is reactive to acidic ingredients, it can easily rust on you if left uncared for or wet, and it's harder than stainless steel. So a lot of professional cooks and chefs love carbon steel because they get super sharp, sharper than stainless, and they hold an edge for a very long time without dulling when compared to stainless. Yes, carbon knives do sort of require a bit more attention and care, but once you own a carbon knife for a little while and get used to taking care of it, it just kind of becomes second nature. If you're using a carbon knife, just do your best to make sure it's dry between uses or else it will rust on you. Over time, a protective coating called a patina is going to form, which is going to stop it from rusting as easily and make it a lot easier to work with, but that comes with use over time. Again, this is generally speaking. There are a lot of different types of stainless steels and carbon steels out there, so, there's a spectrum. The point is here, both carbon and stainless steel are capable of making kick-ass knives. Both get very sharp and will not let you down. All right, so there are plenty of talented knife makers from all over the planet. There are way too many styles of knives to go over in one video. In the culinary community here in the States, there are two big dogs when it comes to knife styles. So on one side, you got Japanese knives known for their superior craftsmanship and attention to detail. Then on the other side, you got world famous European knives, most notably German knives, which we will refer to in this video as Western style knives. Again, comparing Western to Japanese style knives could be the theme of an entire YouTube channel, but here's what I think you need to know as somebody who's just learning about this stuff. Traditionally, Japanese knives are made with hard steel. The hard nature of the Japanese steel means that they can be sharpened razor thin and they can hold their edge for a very long time. Traditional Japanese knives also have handles made from wood. Western style knives are made with a softer steel, which means that there's more material used to make them, giving them a bit of a heftier, bulkier feel in the hand. Both Western and Japanese style knives come in an array of sizes and shapes, all sort of for different kitchen purposes, slicing bread, cutting through protein, chopping through bones. I own knives from both Japan and the West, and they're both great in their own way. When choosing between the two, it comes down to personal preference and what you're trying to use the knife for. The good news is that both styles of knives are sharpened in the same way, so you don't have to worry about that. However true these East versus West knife concepts are, these days, knives come in all steel types and styles. You could totally buy a knife that's made with German steel but looks like a Japanese knife, or vice versa, it just depends. Okay, so before we move into the sharpening part of the video, I want to take a closer look at our blade, specifically what's called the bevel. A bevel is the surface on the blade that has been ground down to form a knife's edge. If you look closely at a knife, it has a single or a double bevel, like this. Single bevel knives have a blade that's basically flat on one side and angled on another. On the other hand, a double beveled knife has a blade that shoots up from two directions, forming an apex of the tip from both sides, you can see right here. Sort of think of like a traditional V shape. I highly recommend a double beveled knife for your first serious knife. When talking about bevel, it's easiest to categorize them by ratio. For example, on one side of the spectrum, you have a 50-50 angle, which is equal parts on both sides of the blade. It creates a bulkier but sturdier blade. On the other side of the spectrum, you have a 90-10 or 10-90 ratio. In that situation, the blade is basically on one side of the knife. A 90-10 blade is going to be razor sharp, but it's also a little brittle when compared to a beefier 50-50. To get the best of both worlds, a lot of people like to sharpen it as 70-30. They kind of get the durability from a double bevel and the thinness from a slightly steeper asymmetrical edge like a 90-10. More on this when we talk about sharpening, and we are almost there, I promise. But before we do that, we have to talk a little bit about sharpening theory. Sharpening a knife is the act of removing metal with an abrasive to either form a new or fix an existing edge. Yes, you heard me right. Every time you sharpen your baby, a bit of its metal gets wiped off into oblivion. Which is why it's important to understand how to remove the metal properly and with what tools to do it. And once you learn how to sharpen, it's gonna save you time and money in the kitchen straight up. No more crushing through expensive ingredients with a dull knife or spending time driving over to the knife sharpener and spending money getting your knife sharpened. It is going to take time and practice, but once you get the hang of it, whetstone sharpening is going to give you the most control over your knife. And now's your chance to really get intimate with your knife, learn what it likes, what it dislikes, what its favorite food is, what its favorite color is, what kind of music it likes to listen to, Get close, get intimate, you're gonna be spending a lot of time together, so, learn each other. So I mentioned whetstones, and that's exactly what we are going to be sharpening with today. In my experience and through my research, the best knife sharpeners in the world all use Japanese whetstones, so if it's good enough for them, it's good enough for me. And we can break down our whetstones into three groups. We have our coarse grit, our medium grit, and our fine grit. Think of grit measurements like sandpaper. The higher the grit number, the finer the actual stone gets. Coarse stones are going to remove the most metal, they're the most abrasive. You really only have to use these when you're trying to create a brand new edge or repair minor damage, not something you're going to want to worry about as a beginner. But good to know, it's good to know what it is. Medium grit stones still remove metal, they're still pretty abrasive, but not quite as abrasive as your coarse stones. Most of your time sharpening is going to be spent on these medium grit stones. Then lastly, there are finishing stones, also called fine grit or polishing, whatever you want to call them. These are going to take your knives from sharp to scalpel status, but not before the work is put in at the lower level grits. You can't just jump ahead to the finer grit stones and expect a sharp knife. To break it down, sharpening really comes down to four things: angle, consistency, pressure, and what's called the burr. Angle is the degree in which your knife comes in contact with the whetstone while you're sharpening. Angle is what's going to determine what bevel ratio your knife has. The steeper or shallower the angle, the bulkier or thinner the edge of the knife. Pressure is the amount of force that you apply to the knife when pressing it against the stone. How hard or soft you press your knife into that stone is going to be a major factor in determining how sharp your knife gets. Consistency refers to how consistent you are with all of the factors we got going on here. The angle, the pressure, the manner in which you rub the knife against the stone, all of these things need to be consistent. That consistency is going to come with practice and muscle memory, which at first you're not going to have, but over time you'll develop it. Okay, lastly, let's talk about the burr. Gucci. Here we go. Burr. Okay, so the burr is simply metal that's pushed from one side to the other as you sharpen. As you drag the knife over the stone, metal is gonna get pushed up onto that other side of the blade. Once a burr is formed, it's our job to flip the knife over and rub the other side of the knife against the stone to remove said burr. The burr lets you know when to stop sharpening and when it's okay to move on to the other side of the knife. When it comes down to it, sharpening is the act of trading burr from one side of the blade to another, then using progressively finer stones to polish that burr away. A good thing to remember is that if a burr isn't formed while you're sharpening, the knife isn't going to be as sharp as it could be. Okay, so now we have an understanding of what we need to do. Let's see it in action. It seems like most experienced knife sharpeners all have a slightly different way of doing it. At first, it's probably easiest to emulate an experienced sharpener almost to the T, but over time, with practice, what's important is that you find a way that works for you. As my friend Justin says, at the end of the day, we're all just primates rubbing tools on rocks. Alright, so it's worth noting that there are literally dozens of ways to get your knife sharp. What I'm about to show you today is definitely not the end-all be-all, it's just the way that I do it, and it works. Alright, let me show you my sharpening setup. I call this my trusty 2-towel setup. I place 2 rags on each side of a sheet tray that's been anchored down with some wet paper towel. The sheet tray is there to catch any water and grit as I sharpen, and you don't need this stone holder thing, you can totally just lay down another towel if you want. Then I have a container towards the top of the setup which allows me to easily scoop water onto the stone to keep it moist as I work. Like anything physical that you want to get good at, it's good to have a walk-up routine, if you will. Yes, that is canned coffee, don't judge me. Think about baseball players before they hit. Many of them have a unique routine on home plate. Over time, it's a good idea to develop similar pre-game habits. It's sort of tough to explain, but I find that having a routine puts me in the right headspace to sharpen effectively. I use the 2-towel system to organize myself when sharpening. All of my unsharpened knives are on one side, then each gets worked on the same stone before they're transferred to the other side. This is especially important when you're sharpening a lot of knives. It just sort of helps organize you and make sure you don't do anything twice on accident. 90% of the time, I start my knives on a medium 1000 grit stone. Soak the stone until it stops bubbling, maybe 3 or 4 minutes, then place it vertically on either the stone holder or your towel. Now that we're set up, let's talk about hand positioning and movement. I'm right-handed, so if you're lefty, just flip this all around. When sharpening, your left hand is going to control the pressure and your right hand will control the angle. The back and forth movement is dictated by your arms and elbows. At first, it can be a little tricky. Both hands and your arms play a different isolated role that all work together to get the job done. Okay, let's start with angle. Knife nerds out there are going to tell you to follow an exact angle to the degree, but as a beginner, there's an easy trick to keep a consistent angle. It's called the penny trick, or the similar-sized foreign currency trick, I guess. Simply stack 3 pennies on the stone and lay your knife on top of those pennies. The angle that the pennies provide is about the right angle that you want to keep when making passes on the stone. Once the knife is lined up, use your pointer finger or thumb to mark the height of the pennies, knock them off the stone, and now you have an angle to work with. Okay, so we now know that the right hand is responsible for angle. That leaves us with our left hand, which is tasked with applying pressure. Okay, so now really quick, I want to talk about pressure, but to do so, I'm going to phone a friend. I mentioned my buddy Justin earlier. This is him. Justin is a badass chef and content creator with years of experience working in Michelin-rated kitchens all over the world and just so happens to be a huge knife nerd. Justin has taught me a ton about sharpening and has a smart way of thinking about pressure that I wanted to share with you guys.
There's a piece of advice that I really like that I didn't include in my videos, which is decide the number of pounds of pressure that you push down. And when you tell someone about this, it's difficult to visualize. And so the analogy is you take a scale, you take your knife, and you press down on the scale to, I believe it's 4 to 5 pounds of pressure is what you want. And so that gives you a sense of, oh, this is what pushing down on a knife, on a stone with 4 pounds of pressure feels like. And then you can check yourself, you know? Do this thing where you press it down, you close your eyes, you press down what you think 4 pounds of pressure is, and you open your eyes and you look. And how close are you? You know, in the same, because that's how you're going to develop that muscle memory sense.
That scale trick is a great way to get a tangible, measurable read on how much pressure you need to apply. But you aren't going to press down on the stone during the entire movement. A good way to remember it is that pressure goes in the direction of the spine of the knife. Whichever way that the spine of the knife is facing is the direction that you apply pressure with your left hand. For demonstration purposes, I'm taking my hand off the knife, but it's totally okay to keep your hand on the knife the entire time so long as your pressure is checked. Just remember to release pressure when pulling or pushing the knife opposite of the spine, or you could damage the knife and/or the stone. When starting off, all of this can be a lot to remember, so to streamline the process, I recommend dividing the knife into sections. However wide your stone and long your knife will determine how many sections of the knife you'll need to sharpen. With the angle fixed and the correct pressure on, you're going to pass the knife in the appropriate section until you can feel the burr pushed up on the edge of the knife. Once you feel the burr in one section, move on to the next, then rinse and repeat until you can feel a burr down the entire length of the knife. Alright, now that we have all the individual parts of sharpening defined and conceptualized, let's see what it all looks like pieced together. Start by stacking your pennies on the stone, grabbing that measured angle and marking it with your finger. Starting at the heel of the knife, place your left hand on the knife and press it into the stone. I like to use 3 fingers to apply pressure. Remember, only apply pressure in the direction of the knife's spine, in this case as the knife is pushed. Make about 15 passes on the stone, making sure to use the full length of the stone from top to bottom. Utilizing the entire stone will make your sharpening more efficient and ensure that the stone stays evenly leveled. After 15 passes, check for the burr. An easy way to detect if a burr is forming is by feeling the side of the edge with the pad of your thumb. If a burr hasn't formed or is nearly undetectable by feel, pass the knife 10 or 15 more times, then check again. Only move on to the next section of the knife when a burr has formed. Once there's a detectable burr, move on to the next section of the knife, pile those pennies up to get your angle, and repeat the process from heel to tip. As you sharpen, you're going to need to periodically wet your stone. Don't worry if your stone and knife begins to get muddy. That mud is actually just a slurry of stone and metal and is actually a helpful abrasive. As you moisten the stone, do your best not to wash that slurry away completely. Once you feel the burr down the entire length of the blade, flip the knife and work on the other side. Remember, it's the same exact technique, the only thing that changes is the direction in which you apply pressure. Stack your pennies, get that angle, press your fingers to the knife, and make another 15 or so passes. Remember, it's less about the number of passes and more about creating than removing the burr. Feel the knife as you sharpen. With practice, you'll be able to tell when it's sharp and what areas of the blade need a little extra love. This could take you 30 passes, 50 passes, it really just depends. Just remember your angle, pressure, and the burr detection technique, and you'll be fine. When the burr is gone, in theory, you should be ready to move up to a finer grit stone. It's optional, but you can dry the knife and do a couple cut tests to feel its sharpness before moving up in stone grit. Once all of my knives have been sharpened on the 1000 grit stone, I move onto my 4000 grit stone. As you move up in grit, the technique remains the same, but the pressure and the number of passes reduces by 20 to 30%. By the time I move into fine grit stones, my edge has already been created, so it's less about removing material and more about polishing the edge with finesse. I work with 3 stones, so by the time I'm at 6000 grit, I'm making maybe 6 to 8 passes and hardly pressing down at all. Pressing too hard at high grits can actually damage the edge, so remember, take it easy. When working with fine stones, the burr can become almost undetectable by feel, so at that point just remember to check your angle with the pennies, reduce the pressure, and trust the process. After I work on the 4000, I might move up to my 6000 grit stone, or I just might cut it off and call it a day. It really depends how I'm feeling and which knives I'm sharpening. If I'm sharpening a knife that I use to cut small intricate items, then I'll take it to 6000, but if it's my everyday workhorse, I'll stop at 4000. No matter how far you take the knives, once you've finished sharpening, clean the edge by running it over something solid like a corner of a wood cutting board or a neglected overly hard piece of citrus if you have one of those laying around. Yeah, you know, it's probably a good idea to remove the mud and metal from the edge of your knives before you cut into something that you plan to cram in your face hole, so yeah. There are a lot of ways to test your knife for sharpness. One popular trick is to rest the knife on your fingernail and turn it on a 45-degree angle. If it catches on your thumbnail, then you're moving in the right direction. If it slips off, then your knife isn't very sharp. This is how devoted I am. This is how much I love you guys. Let's shave my arm a bit. Or if you are willing to have awkward arm hair for a little while, you can do a shave test. 2 really random, weird gaps of hairlessness on my left hand. Tight. When you're done sharpening, always remember to wipe your knives dry and let your whetstones dry off before you store them. And I mean, come on, you knew it was coming. Classic. You can learn how to sharpen and watch me sharpen all day, but how do you know that what I'm showing you actually works? Let me demonstrate. To store your babies, a simple knife cover will do the trick just fine. I highly recommend a wall magnet just because it sort of frees up space on your counters and your drawers, that sort of thing. A knife block works fine, or one of these drawer inserts also works too. I mean, I use them for my steak knives. It's a fantastic little thing. Do not put your good knives in the dishwasher, please. Most people know this already, but you'd be surprised. It does happen. Do not do it. It's not good for the wood. It's not good for the materials. It will dull them fast. It's all around not the move. Also, please do not put your knife in the blender.
Okay.
After using your knives, do your best to get in the habit of washing them, drying them, and storing them right away. The more love, care, and attention you give your knife, the better it will treat you. Before we finish up, this whole knife video would not be complete without talking a bit about honing. To put it simply, honing is the act of realigning an edge that is already sharp. Honing is not sharpening and is not going to sharpen your knife. Instead, it's going to help your knife feel temporarily sharper by pushing steel back in place. Honing rods can be made of a number of different materials, but I recommend getting a ceramic one. Ceramic rods are extremely hard and very smooth, so they're actually a lot gentler on the knives. And you can use them on both Western style and Japanese knives, which is really cool. Okay, I'm gonna say this once. Do not be like Gordon Ramsay. The way he hones his knife is made for TV. I swear to if you ever cook that foie gras. I would be willing to bet a large sum of money that that man is actually causing harm to his knives. To get the benefits of blade realignment from honing, you're gonna wanna be very gentle. It's a finesse thing here, especially when you're using a Japanese knife. You're gonna wanna come in at a 15 to 20 degree angle and gently from heel to tip of the knife, swipe your knife down the entire length of the rod. If you press too hard, if you're too fast, you could actually dull your knife, so don't do that. To hone the knife, I actually have a cool trick for you. It's called the matchbook trick. I learned this one on Chef Step, so shout out Grant over there. There are a number of ways you can do this, but the safest way is to take the tip of your honing rod, place it on the cutting board, and sharpen like so. A great tip to make sure you're coming in at the right angle is to use a matchbook. Using one of these things will ensure that you're coming at about the right angle to hone your knife. Simply shove a matchbook in between your knife and the actual honing rod itself before you make your passes. Do your thing nice and gently. Once you get good enough, you can hone horizontally. Just make sure that the blade is always being pulled away from your body and make sure that angle's nice and locked in. You can hone as often as you want to. Your knife is really gonna be the one that tells you when it wants to be honed. It's really one of those sensory things that you just kind of develop over time after knowing what a sharp knife feels like, knowing what your knife feels like. So if your knife is feeling a little dull after about a week and a half after sharpening it, give it a couple of hones. It'll probably fix the problem. Okay, gear recommendations. I want it to be known this video is not sponsored by anyone, for better or worse, but yeah. A great first big boy knife that I recommend to everyone who asks is this Misono UX10. This UX10 is stainless steel, so you know, if you're running around prepping and you leave the blade wet or leave lemon juice on it, it's not gonna rust out on you. Because it's stainless steel, it's relatively easy to sharpen, and as far as stainless steel goes, this thing actually holds its edge for a long time. I could use this thing heavily for 2 weeks before really starting to feel it dull down. Talk about Japanese versus Western style knives. This is actually the perfect example of a hybrid. You have the classic Western handle followed by a Japanese Western style shape, the Gyuto, and it's stainless steel, it's not carbon. So yeah, you kind of get a nice balance of everything with this knife. This is a great knife from a distinguished brand and I highly recommend it. Now, if you're looking to invest in a single stone, I recommend this 6000-1000 combination stone. And the cool thing about this one is that you can actually keep it soaking and it's not going to chip on you. At least, you know, don't get mad at me. It hasn't split on me or any of my friends who have this stone. So, you know, good experience with this guy right here. It gives you the best of both worlds. You get a medium grit stone to do most of your work on and then a 6000 grit stone to polish on. Sure, you're skipping up a lot of grit, but honestly, as far as combination goes, this thing's awesome. All the other stuff that you see me sharpen with, the plastic pans, the stone holder, the rust eraser, all that stuff, that's all other things that you don't need when you're just starting off. However, if you're interested in purchasing any of those, purchasing a full setup, I will do my best to provide links for everything in the description below. And before I say peace, big shout out to my girlfriend Jess for these beautiful hand-drawn diagrams. You are the best, babe. Appreciate it. I actually think I might hang these up. These are pretty tight. I feel like every self-respecting cooking channel needs to have a knife sharpening video of sorts, so this is mine. Or, you know, at least my first installment. I totally understand that not everybody's gonna wanna sharpen their own knives. To many of you, it might just seem like an expensive, time-consuming, and annoying chore. But for those of you who do take cooking seriously, learning to sharpen and care for your knife is really going to level up your cooking. A giant virtual hug to my friend Justin Kana. Thank you so much for helping me out with this one, man. If you want to take a deep dive on knives, I recommend giving his channel a gander. He's got some great stuff over there. A lot of thought and organization went into making this video, so if you're still watching, thank you so much for doing that, for supporting the channel. I love y'all. And I will see you next week. Stay sharp.
Wow.